Okay, so basically today we are starting with 9.3. And in 9.3, we're basically now looking at the stages of prenatal development. So prenatal development is basically the development that an infant goes through while it's in the mother's womb. So before the baby kind of comes out into the world, what are the different stages of that development that it goes through, as it grows, from an embryo to a fetus kind of level there? What are the different characteristics or key features of that development there for that child? So the first thing we need to understand is that in order for prenatal development to commence, fertilization or conception has to occur first. So fertilization or conception is basically the conception of life itself. And it basically occurs when a male sex cell, which is a sperm, penetrates a female sex cell, which is an ovum, okay, which is an egg. And we learned in chapter 7 that these are, sex characteristics that people usually develop and mature in puberty, okay? And that basically when, the sperm penetrates the ovum, that basically leads to those two sex cells fusing together to make a single kind of overall cell, and that is called a zygote. Now, the zygote is going to have genetic material, obviously both from the mother and the father, okay? So the zygote will usually have 46 chromosomes, okay? That's the typical number. If that number varies, then that can lead to like abnormalities in development that you might see in some of those developmental disorders there. Okay, so usually it's 23 chromosomes from the sperm and 23 from the ova. So basically you've got equal genetic material there from both the mother and the father. So that's the first thing we need to understand, okay, that prenatal development is not possible until life is conceived. Okay, and we have to remember that although fertilization and conception seems really straightforward, we know that there are many couples or many, people who cannot have children. Okay, so fertilization and conception doesn't occur successfully for all people, or at least not all at once. Okay, for some people it happens straight away. For others, they have to, it's a process. So that's basically, and there are factors that can affect fertilization and conception in the same way that there are factors that can influence the health of your baby even after it's been conceived, even while it's developing in the mother's womb. And we'll learn more about that in 9.4. Okay, so anyway, the zygote is the fused cell, and the zygote basically carries that genetic material, okay, in the form of the DNA from both the mother and the father. And obviously we know that, from science, from biology studies you might have done before, that DNA obviously influences those characteristics there. So what sex the baby's going to be, okay, whether it's going to be male or female, what are the physical characteristics of the baby going to be? So hair color, eye color, height, okay. Even things like body shape are influenced by DNA, as well as the rate and timing of their development. So what do we mean by rate and timing of their development? It's basically when does the child reach specific milestones? We know, for example, some children start talking even before the age of 2 years. Okay, some children start talking as early as like 8 or 9 months. So they don't even take that long to start talking. Okay, it doesn't mean that your child is abnormal if they don't start at the exact age, but then there is a kind of like limitations to that as well. So if your child still hasn't started speaking by the age of 3, that's a bit abnormal in the sense that it's not typical. It could mean that there are underlying issues there. Okay, a lot of children start walking, by the age of about 1.5, but that doesn't mean that every child will. Okay, so rate and timing of development means at what time or at what specific age that child shows what we call as milestones. So first word, first signs of talking, first signs of walking, okay, first signs of forming sentences. All of those things are important, okay? Well, when we're talking about prenatal development, we're talking about the development of the child in the womb. So when they start forming limbs, for example, when the brain development starts, all that kind of stuff. This is just literally common knowledge. The typical human pregnancy is over 9 months. So it's in those 9 months that we see the embryo of that baby eventually develop into a fetus, which is the full grown kind of version of the baby. Okay, so that takes the process of 9 months. And I've already talked about sperm production and ova and how that matures and starts during puberty. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense so far. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so when we talk about the prenatal development, we have to remember that there are three main stages. Okay, so you've got the germinal stage, that's the really initial stage. It's only a 2-week period. Then you've got your embryonic stage. So this is a stage where the baby is not really a baby as it would look like a baby yet. We kind of call it the jelly bean stage. The baby looks a little bit like a jelly bean. Okay, so that's the embryonic stage. And that's where we see initial signs of that brain development and the spinal cord development occurring. Okay, every characteristic or feature that starts in the embryonic stage then moves on and becomes more advanced or more developed in the fetal stage. And the fetal stage is the longest stage of prenatal development, because as you can see, the others are only about 2 weeks, and then embryonic is just about 4 to 5 weeks there. Okay, the baby will spend the majority of its time in the fetal stage of prenatal development. Okay, so looking at some key features, when we talk about the germinal stage is that first stage of prenatal development. We say that it starts from the moment of conception, okay? And we say that it kind of ends at about implantation, okay? Implantation is basically when the zygote is implanted in the mother or in the person that's still going to be carrying the baby. So that's basically the germinal stage. Okay, in the germinal stage, you've got the first cell division occurring, okay, and as a result of that first cell division, the egg becomes fertilized as well. And we already talked about what that fertilized egg is called. You've got a small group of cells that form after that first cell division, okay. That group of cells will basically eventually become the baby, but at this point, it's way too early for it to look like a baby, okay. It's just a group of cells. It's called the morula, okay. Now, after the morula kind of differentiates a little bit more, you've got what you call as the blastocyst forming. So the blastocyst is basically a group of cells that basically have differentiated a little bit more. So basically what that means, hold on, I'll just let these people in. Okay, so basically what that means is that the inner part of the blastocyst will become the embryo, okay, and the outer part of the blastocyst will become the placenta. And we know what the placenta is. When babies are born, the placenta is still attached. So that's the outer cell mass, okay? So think of the blastocyst as a big group of cells, okay, a big group of cells, and the inner part of that big group of cells is your embryo. Okay, that is literally the baby at this point. And the outer part or the surrounding outer cell mass is your placenta. Okay, remember at this point in the germinal stage, you don't see anything that looks like the baby. It's literally just the initial stages still happening here. Now, when the blastocyst reaches the uterus, which is obviously the point in which the baby, it's actually the place in which the baby grows throughout the whole pregnancy, okay? When it reaches the uterus, the blastocyst implants itself. That's what we call as the process of implantation, okay? It implants itself in the endometrium, and at this point, only at this point does it become known as the embryo, okay? And at this point, it starts to resemble very, very, very kind of like slightly starts to resemble what the baby will be, okay? It doesn't look like a baby yet, obviously, but it starts to resemble that. Now, as soon as the implantation occurs, the placenta begins to form a little bit more substantially now, okay? Implantation is kind of like the confirmation that, okay, this person's going to have a baby. It's going to happen. Okay, we know that obviously when couples try for babies, it doesn't always work out initially. Okay, it doesn't always work out. They have to, they have to continue because not all people conceive straight away. So when implantation occurs, it's a good sign. It means that this baby is most likely going to happen and it's going to be successful. So that is basically important to know. Okay, so implantation occurs, and after that occurs, that means the placenta begins to form more substantially. So that's the germinal stage. You can see it's just the initial stages where you've got that group of cells. So if I go back to the next slide, you can see even in this picture here, it's just literally a group of cells. It does not look anything like a baby at this point. It doesn't resemble anything that a baby would look like, okay? So it's just a group of cells. That's about it. Okay, so that's the germinal stage. Some other characteristics taken from your book, it had a good diagram and had a good summary of it. Some characteristics of development during the germinal stage. So you can see here, it specifically tells you the step-by-step processes. So you don't need to know this step-by-step, but you just need to understand some of those key ideas. The fact that, after fertilization, the cell divides, okay? The zygote then forms, okay? And then the zygote travels, you don't need to know about the fallopian tube, but it travels down the fallopian tube into the uterus. Okay, that's the basic idea. And then after around 1 week of the conception or fertilization, you've got the blastocyst beginning to implant, okay? And the implantation then occurs. So these are the key words that you should understand for the germinal stage of development, okay? And this is just a more visual diagram to show you. So just a more nicer diagram than the one I tried to draw before. Obviously, you can see that's the blastocyst. Inside, you've got the inner cell mass. This will eventually or will become the embryo, and the outer cell mass you can see is going to be our placenta there. Okay, we're not going to ever ask you to label this. We're not going to give you a diagram asking you to label this, because obviously we're not too focused on the specific parts. This isn't biology. This is more like to do with health. We're just focused on the development side of things, okay? But just know the process and understand these key words, because they are important to the germinal stage. If we ever ask you for one key feature of the germinal stage, you need to be able to tell us one of these things, okay, that we've talked about here, one of those points, or maybe we'll say two of those points. In case you forget one, you've got another one to fall back on. Okay, so that's basically the germinal stage. Okay, so the next stage that we look at is the embryonic stage. And if we just go back to that image there, the embryonic stage you can see is where the group of cells that started in the germinal stage starts to actually resemble what the eventual baby will look like. Obviously, still got ways to go with development, but it kind of starts to resemble what the baby will look like. It's still really small, still looks like a little jelly bean, and I'll show you a more like a real picture of this soon, but yeah, it starts to resemble what a baby will look like, okay? And this is showing you that the conception was successful and the implantation is a continuing process, that the baby is on its way to developing to full term. Okay, we know that there are factors that can influence this as well, though. So not everyone who gets pregnant, for example, will carry the baby to full term. A lot of mothers, unfortunately, have miscarriages. And sometimes it's due to bad habits or their fault of their own, but sometimes it's due to just trauma or injury or other things like that. Okay, so anyway, the embryonic stage occurs from about 3 to 8 weeks. Okay, so that's basically talking about the second stage of prenatal development, and it happens obviously from the time of implantation, okay, until the end of the 8th week after conception. Don't worry too much about these duration, like the numbers relating to duration, just focus more on the key features. So in the embryonic stage, what we see is the child is, or not, we wouldn't call them the child, we'd call them the embryo. The embryo is showing a lot of cell differentiation. What does that mean? That basically means that the cells that make up the body for that embryo are starting to take on specialized roles. So you've got cells that are moving to the area of the heart. Those will eventually become heart cells. You've got cells that are kind of embedding themselves in the areas where skin will be. Those will be your skin cells. Okay, even with bones, you've got bone cells that are basically going to take on that specialized function. So cell differentiation means that the cells that will take on specific functions in the body move to those relevant parts of the body. Okay, the same thing happens with organs. Okay, so the baby's organs basically start to form, and they start to basically show initial starting development there. Okay, so the heart, the brain, the lungs, all of these organs and these systems start to form. We already talked about what the placenta is. The placenta is basically this vital organ, okay? It's really important. It basically protects the embryo, okay? Remember we said that when we've got the blastocyst in the germinal stage, the embryo is on the inside and the placenta surrounds it on the outside, okay, of the blastocyst group of cells there. So that's basically the placenta. Now the placenta is like a little protective pouch, okay? It's protective because it actually helps to supply oxygen and nutrients for the baby, but it also helps to remove waste products, and it also helps to act as a filter from any harmful substances. But it can only work as a filter for so long. It's only got so much filtering properties there. So obviously, if you've got a mother who's constantly smoking, constantly drinking alcohol, constantly taking drugs, that obviously is, the placenta is not invincible. Those harmful substances can penetrate through the placenta and eventually reach the baby there, okay? Or reach the embryo, I mean. So it's important to remember that although the placenta is there to protect the baby and provide nutrients, in the same way that nutrients and in the same way that oxygen can reach through the placenta to the embryo, you've also got those harmful substances like alcohol, like drugs, okay, like medication or tobacco that can also then permeate and penetrate through that placenta. So the placenta is not some shield. It's supposed to be protective, but if the mother's doing all these bad habits and isn't really looking out for the best interests of that baby or that embryo there, it can't really be protected by the placenta alone. Okay, you have to take precautions. And this is why we say that these teratogens, or these teratogens, like these harmful substances, basically, like tobacco, alcohol, medication. Now, this could be in the form of prescription drugs or in the form of other drugs like illicit drugs. Okay, so again, any of these things can influence the baby's development, okay, by causing these harmful substances to penetrate through the placenta and affect the embryo there. The problem with this is because the embryonic stage is still an early stage, nothing's really set in stone, nothing's really developed fully. The main issue is that the baby's brain and spinal cord development that's still developing there can actually be very significantly affected by this, okay? And then in the next spread, we'll look at how a child whose mother smoked while they were still in the embryonic stage looks like compared to a normal child. The actual physical appearance of that child is different, okay? The eyes are a lot more sunken, the forehead's a lot more smaller, okay? So we'll talk about this in the next slide. But teratogens, you have to remember, are extremely harmful, particularly in this stage where the baby is so impressionable and where the baby's development is at such an early stage that it's so easy for that baby's development to be compromised or negatively affected in this stage more than any other stage, okay? So that's why we say the embryo is very sensitive to environmental influences in this stage. And that's why a lot of people, most people who have miscarriages or who miscarry, it generally happens in the embryonic stage, okay, at the 8-week period. It can happen later as well, but this is where the baby is most sensitive to those kinds of harms from the environment, or those teratogens that we say. Okay, so you do need to know what the definition of a placenta is for the sac, and you do need to know what teratogens are, along with maybe 1 or 2 examples. You also need to know what the word organogenesis means, and you also need to understand what the word cell differentiation means. Okay, these are all key features of the embryonic stage. So if you know 2 of them really well for the sac, you'll be all good, but overall you need to know what each one means as well. Okay. So that's the embryonic stage. And again, this is just taken from your book because it was a nice table. I just put it in. You've got obviously the different weeks, okay, associated with the embryonic stage, and then what happens in each week. Now, we're not going to be that pedantic and ask you guys, okay, outline specifically what happens in week 3, because it's going to be a lot of stuff to learn. So you know what, don't worry about the weeks. So just cut out the weeks here. Just understand that these are the general key features or characteristics of the embryonic stage. So if you know at least 2 from here for the sac, you'll be all good. Okay, some of these are repeated from the previous slide, but some of them are a little bit more, more specific. For example, blood cells being made in the liver. That's a more specific feature, but you can learn that one if you want to. Okay, so that's basically so many different key features or characteristics there, so many dot points. You just need to know 2. Okay, 2 for each stage. So those are the characteristics of the embryonic stage. And you can see, guys, by the end of the embryonic stage, the brain is active, okay? The fingers and the toes of the embryo have started to form. So as I said before, you no longer have just a mass of cells. They actually starts to look like a baby now at this point, okay? Now, the last stage is the fetal stage, and the fetal stage of prenatal development is the longest stage, it goes from 9 weeks to 38 weeks. So it basically 9 weeks to full term, to when the baby is born. So this is it's a very long stage, goes over a few months. Okay, so 9 weeks to the baby being born, because most babies are born at 38 weeks if there are no other complications. So you can imagine that this stage would have a lot more drastic and a lot more kind of like significant changes and key features compared to the other two stages. Okay. Now this stage is obviously a period of extensive growth. So whatever has grown and developed in the baby continues to grow and develop, and more importantly, continues to mature. So if the heart was already starting to develop in the embryonic stage, it will continue to develop and mature and grow in size as the baby progresses through the fetal stage there. Okay, if the lungs had started to develop, if the fingers and toes had started to grow and develop there, they will continue to lengthen and become longer or become bigger in size. And that obviously is again underlined by the baby becoming bigger in size in the mum, and that's obviously why the mum's tummy gets a lot bigger in the fetal stage compared to the others. Okay, so by 14 weeks, the placenta is fully developed. Okay, remember we said the placenta is that protective kind of pouch that the embryo is in. And obviously, as the embryo turns into a fetus, it's still kind of protected by the placenta. Okay, the placenta is basically a disc-shaped organ. Okay, it's temporary because once the baby's born, it's not going to have the placenta forever. Okay, usually the placenta is removed after the baby's born there. Now, the placenta obviously allows for the exchange of substances. We looked at this in the previous slide. So in the same way that the placenta helped the embryo, allowing it to have oxygen, allowing it to have access to nutrients, it continues to help the fetus. Remember, guys, the embryo and the fetus are literally the same thing, as in not the same thing, but once the embryo has reached the end of that stage of 8 weeks, it then turns into a fetus. Okay. And both of these are basically protected by that pouch, or that we call the placenta. Where is that word? There we go. Okay, so embryo turns into the fetus, which is obviously, both of those are still protected by the placenta, which is that protective pouch. Okay, so that's basically our fetal stage. Again, showing you some key characteristics of the fetal stage, and just going to wipe out those weeks, because obviously we're never going to ask you for a specific week in the stage of that prenatal development. Okay, these are so many different points here. Look, we're not going to ask you guys how many centimeters is the fetus in week 11. Like, that's too complicated, and that's too hard for you to understand and memorize. Okay, we don't care about the numbers here. What we do want to know though is facts like, okay, the fingers and toes which developed in the embryonic stage have now started to grow nails. Okay, that's a good point there. You can talk about something like eyebrows and eyelashes grow. Okay, we're looking for the more descriptive characteristics. We want you to be able to describe what changes occur in each prenatal stage of development. We don't want you to just blindly memorize numbers like how long something is. Okay, this is not important. So stressing that, because I know there's a lot of numbers in this spread of the book. You don't need to memorize those numbers or those lengths or those weights and that kind of stuff. Okay. Anyway, I want you guys to look at this picture now. This shows you how the baby's changing. So this is at 5 weeks. Here you can see that this baby is still in the embryonic stage. Remember, we said the embryonic stage goes up to 8 weeks. So at 5 weeks old, this baby is still in the embryonic stage. And remember I said before that at this point, the baby looks like a jelly bean? Because it does. Look at it. It looks like a jelly bean. Okay. It doesn't look like an actual baby just yet. It's formed. It looks like what could become the baby. It's a more accurate representation of a baby than what it was in the germinal stage. It's no longer just a mass of cells, but it's basically not it's not a fully formed baby yet. Okay, so you can see at 5 weeks, the limbs, the eyes, the heart, the liver, okay, all of the other organs have just started to develop in the embryo. Okay, and we can see that little development, that slight development there. Okay, at 14 weeks, now this is obviously in the stage of the fetal development now. So both of these pictures here, guys, are showing you the fetal development. And you can see here that the baby actually looks a lot more like a baby, okay? You can see the baby's inside here, and you can see that little bubble that it's in, that's the placenta. Okay, so this is the baby. Started off as the embryo, then became the fetus. Okay. This is the placenta that it's in, the protective pouch. Okay. And you can see as the baby gets older, as the weeks increase, as it goes to 20 weeks here, you can see the baby can barely fit in that placenta anymore. It's growing in size. Okay. So basically that's showing you that the placenta actually doesn't necessarily get bigger to accommodate the baby. The placenta itself is quite big, but the baby kind of grows within that placenta. Okay, so this is at 20 weeks, and this is usually by the end of that second trimester for the woman who's pregnant or the mother. Okay, and you can see the baby has shown a lot more growth. Within just 6 weeks, 14 weeks to 20 weeks, the baby looks a lot bigger. It looks like almost a fully formed baby at this point. Okay, but obviously it's still got about 18 weeks to go before it's actually born there. So that's basically showing you the characteristics of the development in the fetal stage. Okay, so just know again any two. Okay, any two characteristics there. You can either learn the ones from this slide or the ones from the previous slide. Okay, and just showing you guys just as an overall summary now what this looks like. Okay, so at 9 weeks, that's when the fetal stage begins. Okay, at 12 weeks, that's when your sex organs differentiate. At 16 weeks, that's when the fingers and toes develop. At 20 weeks, that's when hearing begins. So the child can start to hear things that are happening outside the environment. Okay, and this is when some mothers like to play like Quran in the background or music in the background so that their baby, or calming sounds in the background, because this is the point where the baby can actually start hearing things that are happening outside. 24 weeks is when the lungs begin to develop. Okay, 28 weeks is when the brain has already obviously developed and started to grow. But at 28 weeks, the baby's brain grows rapidly. Okay, so the neural connections are starting to get consolidated there and starting to get established very, very rapidly there. Okay, at 32 weeks, that's when the bones have fully developed. So the baby starts to look quite sturdy, starts to look quite strong. Okay, if you look at the baby on an ultrasound, it looks a lot more formed and a lot more structured, you could say, because the bones have started to fully develop there. It doesn't look like a jelly bean anymore, obviously. Okay, 36 is when the muscles fully develop. And obviously you can see that the bones fully developing and the muscles fully developing are two signs that the baby is now getting ready to come out into the world, okay, to be born. And at 40 weeks, we've got full-term development. Now, we know a lot of women generally tend to give birth at 36 to 38 weeks. So if a woman, however, or if a mother doesn't give birth at 38 weeks and they give birth at 40 weeks, the baby will come out fully formed. That's the full-term development. That means that you've carried your baby to full term, okay? Obviously, we know that pregnancies can occur a little bit more delayed or on time. So again, this will depend on the mother. This will depend on things like birth complications. This will depend on the general development of the baby as well, okay? Because not all babies develop at the same exact rate. So there can be 1 or 2 or 3 weeks difference there in some. Okay, so that's basically talking about the progression from the fetal stage. That's why we started about 8 or 9 weeks here to the birth stage. Okay, so we haven't included the embryonic or germinal stage in this diagram here. Okay, those happened before. Yeah, that's about it for today. So I'll just stop the recording here.